the Earth Law Center, the world's first nonprofit dedicated to advancing nature's rights, and was its first executive director. While there, she worked to enact nature's rights in law, develop international nature's rights tribunals, develop and teach Earth law in legal and master's programs, launch comprehensive reports on co-violations of nature's rights and human rights. And she also brought the rights-based movement to the attention of the United Nations General Assembly. Later, working for the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation as Senior Counsel and Grants Manager, Linda developed new climate solutions through collaborative impact investing, advanced modern economic models that better support human and environmental well-being, and continued to support the nature's rights movement. She also provided analysis and targeted recommendations on philanthropic strategies, climate change, water management, sustainability, conservation, and the advancement of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Please mute yourself, everybody. Linda has published extensively, including environmental rights, the development of standards through Cambridge University Press in 2019, and Stanford Law on California water governance for the 21st century. In 2017, she's taught nature's rights laws at Vermont Law School and has done a TED Talk on rights-based climate strategies. Linda currently supports thriving California waterways and forests and advances nature's rights more generally as executive director of the California-based nonprofit Environment Now. She remains profoundly committed to developing and implementing lasting, effective solutions to the socio-ecological stressors that we and the Earth face together. And I'll just end by saying Linda is also an aspiring martial artist. So thank you so much for joining us today, Linda, and for sharing your thoughts and some of your work with us today.
Well, thank you so much, Jennifer and Karen and Kristen and the rest of the team that invited me to speak to you all today. I'm really thrilled to have this opportunity to talk a little bit about rights of nature, especially from a forest perspective, because there's been a lot of really interesting work around the globe on that. That hopefully we can get some lessons from locally here on the West Coast. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully that works. Let's see. Can everybody see that okay? Yeah. Okay, great. So just clear a couple of things off. All right. So I know I have about a half an hour, and I will definitely not go over that because I love the Q&A more than anything. So if it seems like I'm whipping through the slides fairly quickly, I have left a copy of the PowerPoint with the organizers, so anybody who's interested can have a copy. So just jumping in the intro, it indicated I had a bit of a background in advocacy, and I've done traditional environmental advocacy for many years. And it was out of frustration with that work that I started looking at some of the core foundational reasons for that frustration and that lack of progress, and saw that, as many of you know, that our U.S. environmental laws came out of the 1970s from really significant pollution incidents. And I am certainly more than old enough to remember a lot of those personally. And at the time, it was pretty exciting to have these new laws that were going to fix everything and apparently make things all better. But the problem was that they bought into the existing frame, which we'll get into, and effectively legalized pollution and ongoing degradation, with the result of many of the headlines that we all see today. And it seems that things are getting worse all the time, especially in some of the climate-related events we've been seeing recently. And these ecological stressors are just expanding and increasing. We're facing a sixth mass extinction. Despite the rains this year, drought is an ongoing threat. Even the United Nations is saying that we're moving towards an unlivable world. And as we start to shrink the number of species and habitats, we don't seem to get more urgent in our actions. We seem to marginalize them even further, to the point where we're seeing even bipartisan think tanks saying that we should be conducting endangered species triage to try to address the problem. So in my own work, over the years, I blamed a lot of different suspects. I first blamed myself for not working hard enough or smart enough. Then I blamed industry opposition, which was well-funded, money and politics, political will, agencies that never seemed to get the job done. The public, is very busy, and it's hard to understand these complex rules. And certainly that's the case with courts, especially in the water realm where I have most experience. The water laws are incredibly complicated. But ultimately, to me, it seemed to get down to framing. And Gifford Pinchot, of course, as you know, the first head of the U.S. Forest Service, had an ethic or a direction where he said, we need to produce from the forest whatever it can yield for the service of man, which was better than the mantra that came right before him, which was basically clear cut everything. So at least he was trying to say save a little bit. But it was really about the forest serving people. And the assumption there was that the forest and elements of the natural world, species, ecosystems are property. That's their inherent essence. It's property that we need to maintain for continuing economic use by humans. And this photograph, which I really like, I always thought it was Yosemite, and it's really Hetch Hetchy. And that was the core of the dispute between Pinchot and his contemporary John Muir, who had a very different framing. Again, as I'm sure everybody in this call is familiar, John Muir talked about the web of life and the intricacies of our interconnections. And Thomas Berry, who came later, who was an Earth geologian, said that Earth is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. That species and forests and trees, et cetera, are not objects. They're subjects of this earth citizenship, this collective that we need to self-govern ourselves in a way that recognizes their own inherent essence as subjects. And he called this earth jurisprudence. And jurisprudence in the legal world means a philosophy of law. So it's an earth-centered philosophy of law that Thomas Berry developed and named. And the assumption here, contrary to Pinchot, is that well-being is not really tied to sort of this economic advancement, this neoclassical / neoliberal model, but it's about us nurturing each other, us nurturing nature, so that nature nurtures us. And this idea about the role of economics is a whole separate, couple of webinars at least. But what I call degradation economics ignores this inherent relationship and our place within this larger Earth system. So right now we assume in the top graphic that the economy is sort of the overarching thing that we're trying to protect. And then human society is within that, human resources, and then Earth lies below that. So we have this idea that Earth and humans serve the economic system, which consumes nature for profit. And if you think about the terms that a lot of people use to convey environmental progress, sustainable development, green economy, natural capital, it's an adjective noun problem. The noun is economy, development, capital. That tells you what your focus is. That's the economy. The green, the natural, the sustainable, that's the adjective, that's the tangent. So it's really telling you what we're doing. And we're just trying to maximize short-term wealth for the few. But if we actually want to move ahead and get past this logjam that we're facing, we need to just face reality. I mean, we're basically passing laws against gravity. The alternative is to recognize the world we live in and ground the economy in the earth. The economy is just a human construct. It's made up by people. And so the economy needs to serve humans, serve the earth with a larger goal, the appropriate adjective noun combination, which could be thriving communities, where community is the noun, this idea of humans and nature flourishing together, maximizing socio-ecological well-being. So Donella Meadows, and I've got some reading at the end that identifies where some of these sources are. Donella Meadows says that we get caught up in the mechanics of the system and we should be focusing on its design. And we need larger system level changes rather than just trying to tweak at the edges. So framing in this context matters. When we have an Endangered Species Act, and a lot of people think that's rights of nature, but really think about it from a different perspective. What would a healthy species act look like? What would that bar look like? How many species and what diversity of species would we have if our bar was higher than, let's do what we want to do until there's like so few left that we could give them names? that's not an appropriate strategy to be able to protect ourselves and protect the natural world. So this idea of well-being and what are we trying to achieve, Adam Smith gets blamed a lot for the economic system, but he actually wrote a lot about the ethics that we should be approaching. And, he doesn't get enough credit for that, I think. And he talked about well-being being found in the context of responsibility to love and care for each other and for the community. His idea of economics was grounded in small communities where everybody knew each other. And you couldn't be an outlier and try to take advantage of people and do well in the community. Aldo Leopold extended this ethic out to nature and recognized that natural systems and species are part of Earth, this idea that Thomas Berry talked about as a subject in this larger communion of subjects, and that our role is not as a conqueror or manager. Denial of rights in this case is a form of separation. The word apartheid means separation. And so if you deny something rights, if you deny nature rights, you're denying its role in that relationship that we have with the natural world. So we need to repair that. We need to start attacking the frame. And so this seems like a lot, throughout history, at least the last few hundred years, we've been finding rights and declaring them to be self-evident and putting them in law. And Christopher Stone wrote about this in the early 70s in Should Trees Have Standing, his law journal essay. And he talked about the elements in law of recognizing rights, having them heard before a public body, having their own standing, having representation, and being able to get recompense for their own injury, not just a check written to the human owner, which is entirely different. So this idea of nature's rights started to move forward in 2010 on a global level. We'll get to Ecuador in a minute, which came first in 2008. But in 2010, the World People's Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth came about because in Copenhagen the fall before, that was supposed to be the climate change summit that was going to fix everything, and it didn't. So the Global South, which felt extraordinarily marginalized by that particular climate summit, said we can't have movement forward on climate change unless we also recognize the rights of nature. So they had 35,000 people from 140 nations come together and adopt a universal declaration on the rights of Mother Earth, which was grounded in this idea of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. The idea of human rights came about after World War II because the drafting committee and the UN decided that the value of humans, these inherent rights, didn't come from a government, but they originated because we exist. And the same logic applies to natural systems. So the Universal Declaration on Human Rights says the inherent rights of Mother Earth arise from the same source as existence. And similarly, the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth says that Mother Earth and its beings have the right to life and exist, just as the Declaration on Human Rights talks about the right to life, liberty, and security of person. So you're seeing this parallel discussion and this linking of human rights and nature's rights, and of course, the rights of indigenous peoples. And if you look at ecojurisprudence.org, it was just launched last fall. It's a very comprehensive and academically grounded summary of what's been developing on nature's rights. There are 24 nations around the world that have some form of nature's rights in law in various ways, in over 50 cities and counties across 14 states in the United States. So there's in a number of tribal lands as well. So there's been, you can see the graphic, there's been incredible movement over the years on nature's rights. And I'd like to dig in, again, I apologize for moving fairly quickly, but I'd like to dig into a couple of examples that are related to forests. And the first is in Ecuador, as I promised. I mentioned in 2008, Ecuador amended its constitution, and here are a couple of the key provisions related to recognition of the rights of nature to exist and maintain itself. And it includes an enforcement provision, of course, that any person may demand the observance of these natural rights. And then Article 72 mentions that nature has a right to be completely restored, independent of its utility to people. And these echo those elements of Christopher Stone's Should Trees Have Standing? What does this mean to hold rights in a practical way? And just as a side note, this isn't in the PowerPoint because it just happened yesterday and was announced today. Ecuador had 2 referenda on their ballot yesterday, their national ballot, one about oil drilling in Yasuni Amazon forest, and then another on gold mining in a forest just outside Quito. And both of them passed overwhelmingly banning oil extraction, which amounts to 12% of Ecuador's extraction, and then in this particular forest in the Amazon, and banning the mining in the forest outside of Quito. It wasn't close. And I think this is in large part due to this socialization of the idea of rights of nature since 2008 in Ecuador. So they've been real leaders on this. There's been a couple of examples of this in the courts as well. In the Los Cedros Cloud Forest victory, the Constitutional Court of Ecuador in December of 2022 applied these two rights of nature constitutional provisions to block even exploratory mining activity in the protected forest. Existing law had already allowed these permits to be issued, but the rights of nature said, no, you can't do that. It violates nature's rights. So it had a real impact for this forest. And then more recently, in the Integ Valley, communities have been fighting for decades to stop mining that was also destroying forests in the habitat that they lived in. And in fact, the mining company had been funding the police to be really quite violent in pushing back on this. And their successful appeal relied in large part on rights of nature as well as the right to consultation. So again, in Ecuador, we're seeing some real impacts. New Zealand has a slightly different, it's interesting rights of nature because it arises and comes about in different ways, which I find is just extraordinarily interesting. In New Zealand, it's come about through treaty agreements and the recognition by the Crown government in New Zealand that they needed to recognize and make amends for the treaty violations that they had been doing over many, many years. Against the Maori. And so there have been several instances where individual ecosystems, so you can see Mount Taranaki here, the Whanganui River was one of the leaders, and then Te Urewera Forest, where in each case, the Crown government and the Maori, the local tribes, the iwi, recognized legal standing for these entities out of recognition that none of them could be owned in an absolute sense. And that created space for the tribes to insert their own cosmology, their own way of governing and self-governing in these spaces. So a really unique and interesting model. And the Te Urewera Forest recognizes the local Tahoi knowledge, values, and customs as guiding and facilitating management of these forest ecosystems. And what's interesting is that it's now being actively implemented through a coordinated process with the federal government where the local tribe, the indigenous peoples, who have knowledge about what this forest needs are actively listening, taking active practices to listen and understand what the forest needs and incorporate that, which is really sort of groundbreaking when you think about it, to actually think and to listen to what ecosystems need, rather than put our own understanding of what that is on top of that. Another example, and again, another way that rights of nature has come about is in Colombia, which does not have any rights of nature language in either statute or its constitution, unlike Ecuador, for example. There's what's called a tutela action in Colombia, but it's present in many Latin American countries. It's a streamlined way to address human rights before the highest courts in the land. And in this case, a group of young people, kind of like the Montana case that we just had here in the States, brought litigation around climate change. And they said their future was being impacted. And it was a human rights issue because of climate change. And this was after nature's rights were recognized in a lower constitutional court case in the Atrato River. This Amazon case came about after that, and the Colombia Supreme Court said that the Amazon is a subject of rights under its constitution, even though the plaintiffs had not asked for that, and even though the Constitution doesn't say that. They said you cannot have a human right to a healthy climate unless the climate in the forest itself has its own right to be healthy and to have a healthy climate. You can't have a right to something that has no right to exist. So the court ordered the state and local agencies to create short to long-term plans, particularly to address deforestation, which is significantly associated with climate change in Colombia, to take other climate change actions. And in the United States, as I mentioned earlier, there have been well over 50, I think over 60 now, ordinances, county and city ordinances that have been passed around the country. Pittsburgh is the largest city with one of these ordinances, and it came about because of community concern over fracking. And then in Santa Monica, here in California, their ordinance is similar and recognizes rights of nature, adds an enforcement provision, and recognizes that corporate entities don't have special rights. What's interesting about Santa Monica is they then implemented another ordinance they enacted another ordinance that implemented rights of nature in the city, specifically around the groundwater table, around aquifer rights, and banning private wells until the aquifer's needs were better understood and better addressed. And then finally, at the UN level, we're seeing a lot of work through the UN Harmony with Nature initiative. And there's some links there. Again, I'll leave the PowerPoint with you, but I recommend taking a look at those. There's a good compilation of information there as well, including an experts library with a lot of background material. And the current UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and the Environment is also a specialist in rights of nature, David Boyd. So there's a lot of connections there going on at the UN as well. One area, so bringing all this down, this is a lot about other countries and what's going on there. And to remember, they started exactly where we are, with nothing, blank slate, and then bringing up rights of nature since 2008 in Ecuador. And the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature is an organization that started shortly after the Ecuadorian Constitution Amendment was passed. It's a global network of thousands of organizations and individuals that are working to advance nature's rights globally. And they have created this model of tribunals, which is modeled on the permanent people's tribunals that some of you may be familiar with, that addresses human rights more broadly that aren't being addressed by regular courts of law. And it's called International Rights of Nature Tribunals, in which tribunal judges hear expert and witness testimony and assess that information against the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, which we heard about earlier, as well as existing nature's rights laws where applicable, such as in Ecuador. There's a website dedicated to that, and most of these are international and regional, but there have been local tribunals as well. I participated in 2 Bay Area tribunals myself, and they could be a very powerful way, if you don't have the law developed yet, to start to show how the law might look if you actually had rights of nature in place. So just as one example, and this is very recent, just in the last couple of weeks, there's a train line, 900-mile train line that's about half completed now in Mexico, but it would irreparably destroy indigenous lands and ecosystems along this line through massive deforestation and contamination of aquifers and other impacts. And of course, cultural diversity would be destroyed as well. And so the tribunal was organized. They asked the Global Alliance to help put a tribunal together. And the tribunal found in July a verdict of ethnocide and ecocide, and prepared a detailed summary. And the judges were expert judges on the substantive issues and on rights of nature and human rights and indigenous peoples' rights. And that was finalized fairly recently, just in the last week or 2. And now local communities and organizations are going to take that verdict and apply it to other international actions and bodies, such as the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, to see if they might be able to get more traction there. So you're hearing a lot of opportunities and actions by people around the world to be able to move this idea forward. And it's as the Garn likes to say, the Global Alliance likes to say, and there's nothing more exciting than an idea whose time has come. And as you recall from that graphic from ecojurisprudence.org, you're seeing it take off like wildfire around the world. And there are opportunities for anybody to be engaged with this work. All these different tools are available to people who have different skill sets that might be able to be interested in advancing this. From the local level here in the States, there are a number of groups that are doing this that folks could be associated with or reach out to the global level as well. And one thing on the global level that we often forget here in the States, and I as a lawyer completely didn't know this until I started working in this space, is that even though it doesn't seem as critical or important, as significant in the States, legal rulings in other countries can be used as precedent or guidance in other nations' courts. So you see one nation pulling from another nation's rights of nature court decision, or even pulling from journal articles and using them significantly in developing their decisions. So even though it seems like, you know, what's going on globally may not be so significant, it's actually very significant in building a body of law worldwide. So, you know, just in summary, if you take away sort of one thing from this, it would be that law evolves. We have this idea, and I guess two things: law evolves and economics evolves. You know, the existing economic system is not, you know, that old, and both of these things are things that we made up and that we can change. And we have to have sort of a general sense of where we'd like to go. One idea would be law that guides us to become mutually enhancing human presence on the earth, giving back more than we take. So more of a concept that indigenous peoples have known for millennia: live in concert with the earth and respect the earth and give back more than we take. And when we're faced with a decision-making point, ask, you know, would this action enhance the integrity and the health and the functioning of the larger earth community, not just the economics of the people who might own the particular forests or species at hand. And then Danella Meadows, the systems thinker who I just love, her advice is to just keep doing it, just keep talking, keep acting, but, you know, act humbly, and always keep learning. And speaking of learning, again, I'll leave this with you, but there's some great open access and, you know, fairly cost-effective pieces that I recommend if you're interested in learning more. So I'll stop sharing at this point and open it up for questions. And I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. So I hope that stopped sharing. There. Great.
Okay, thank you so much, Linda. That was a fascinating presentation and just an amazing issue that that we should all support. So we do have a few questions. Can you identify the roots of our environmental dysfunctions?
Can I identify the roots of our environmental dysfunctions? Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, it depends on sort of where you are, you know, in the continuum. But I think today it's largely, you know, what I was talking about in terms of we have blinders on, I think, because of our economic system. We just take for granted, like, you know, in my work doing advocacy, we took for granted that, you know, we had to frame everything that we did, you know, that this would be good for the economy. This would be good for jobs. You know, the economy is going to be just fine if we do this. And this idea of, you know, this adjective noun problem that I mentioned earlier, it doesn't really occur to people. I could say it didn't occur to me until I started, you know, thinking about this and doing more of this work and reaching this level of frustration with existing law, that, you know, if we don't recognize natural systems, you know, trees, species, fish, water, as having their own inherent dignity, their own inherent rights and value that we should respect and be humbled by, then, you know, we will continue to fail. So I think it's a combination of things. The economic system is sort of the indicator, but I think this fundamental misunderstanding of our relationship with Earth's systems is really at the core of what our problems are. We've drifted away from that understanding and we need to bring ourselves back.
Okay, great. And one attendee wants to know, what were the Bay Area tribunals that you have participated in?
So I've participated in a couple of tribunals as what they call co-prosecutor. And the one we tended to hold the international ones alongside the climate change conferences because everybody just was there. So, you know, it was more cost effective. So I was a co-prosecutor for the tribunal for the Paris at the Paris COP. And then the Bonn, Germany climate change conference as well. And then also worked on the two climate change conferences here in the San Francisco Bay Area. One was around Delta waters and waterways and flows and contamination. And then also another one was around the Chevron tribunals here in the Bay Area in Richmond.
Um, and Maya Kostla has a question, prefacing by the information that here in the US, as well as in British Columbia, tribe members are being provided big grants and monies by government agencies, including federal agencies, so that they can promote logging and extraction on tribal lands. So some tribe members in BC are fighting the logging companies, but they seem to be in the minority. How does the rights of nature movement interface with this trend, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little bit familiar with what you're talking about. I have some colleagues that work up there, and the challenge is that, you know, because we also did not value, in fact, you know, caused a significant, you know, ecocide, ethnocide associated with Indigenous peoples here in the States and in Canada. People have been displaced from their original homelands and are at a loss to try to be able to support themselves because of the way that they've been situated. Some of the tribes that are, you know, in my understanding, that are moving forward with some of these initiatives would like to be able to live in the way in which they had been living for millennia before, you know, colonizers came in and moved them off those lands. And so some of the implementation of these larger goals is challenging. And so I think that the larger sense of moving towards that larger goal, I think, is something that is generally shared. But, you know, and it's something that in some cases, you know, maybe if it's not as generally shared, it will be. But, you know, that just depends on the specific situation. But I think that it's a larger, more complex discussion that needs to recognize the damage and the injury and the ethnocide that we are responsible for.
Okay, thank you for that. Can you address how this work might help stop the clear cutting occurring in the Sierras, particularly by forced industry owners like Sierra Pacific Industries?
So there's a couple of options there. So what some people have done, and I mentioned these ordinances, what a lot of communities have done around the country they've gone and passed local ordinances, local laws that around particular threats, environmental threats that they were concerned about. So, you know, fracking, spreading of sewage sludge, you know, extraction of groundwater for profit, gravel mining, you know, any sort of nefarious activity that might damage a community against their will, you know, you could probably name, and there's probably been an ordinance related to that. SOLDIF is an organization in Pennsylvania, but with a lot of regional folks now, Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, that's been behind most of these ordinances, and you could check their website and learn more about that. So one thing that people have done is to pass local laws that say that, you know, ecosystems and species, including forests, have rights, and that, you know, logging is a violation. In this particular case, you might say logging is a violation of those rights, and that logging should be banned under this ordinance. So people have been doing that as one option. And if there was, I mentioned earlier that Pittsburgh did that with regard to fracking. And if you look on Frack Tracker, which is another website where you can sort of see where fracking is, you can sort of see, you know, Pittsburgh, you know, fairly free of fracking. And that may be related to the ordinance and companies going, you know, I don't know that this is necessarily worth it here. It seems like I've got a fight on my hands. The other option, you know, or would be to hold a tribunal, to hold a local tribunal to raise awareness about the issue. To say that the timber companies are violating the inherent rights of forests and bring experts in and have that, you know, recorded, et cetera. And again, the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature has done a lot of these and would be happy to provide, you know, would be happy to chat and, you know, share some information about things they've learned from other tribunals. So there's different options that could be approached. We don't have rights of nature law in the States, you know, at more than a local level right now, unlike, say, Ecuador. So it's more challenging. But it's, like Donella Meadows was saying, it's a stepwise process. Keep acting, loudly and with assurance. And eventually, as we saw with that curve, people start to come along.
Okay. So capitalism privatizes profits and socializes liabilities. How does this change? I assume meaning how would this change if the rights of nature were adopted?
Yeah, so and that's why I bring up economics with rights of nature, because you can't sort of have a conversation about rights of nature without talking about the role of economics. And there are folks who are doing really good work on alternative models of economics, ecological economics, earth-centered economics. Again, if you go on the harmonywithnature.un.org website, the UN has been having various annual General Assembly dialogues that talk about different elements of Earth-centered governance, not just law, but also economics, and other disciplines, science, et cetera. So you can see some of the folks who have been working in that space, like Dr. Josh Farley with the University of Vermont, and some of the work they've been doing. So I don't pretend to be an economist, but I do try to talk about that because it's something that we need to start to shift as well. We absolutely need to shift this idea of nature as being monetized and capitalized. The idea of natural capital as saving nature, I just don't agree. That reinforces the existing economic system. So we need to start to think about economics that maximizes socio-ecological well-being and not maximizes profit for, a relatively few number of people.
Okay. Has there been discussion of nature's rights to not be being trampled by human overpopulation?
Yeah, I mean, overpopulation definitely comes up, and that concept, it's a little more amorphous. It's like who's the entity that you're trying to sort of raise issue with. So it's sort of more of a societal. It's more societal policy than sort of like in Ecuador and Los Cedros, where you could point to the person who is trying to do the mining or the oil extraction. But absolutely, overpopulation has come up. But even where, and this has been coming up for a long time, and when I get asked this question, I say, even where there's been not very many of us, we can do an awful lot of damage. So I would say that we really, even with the number of people we have, we could learn to live more in concert with the earth, and we're going to have to. And as a result of that, we might start to realize that a few less of us might be a good idea.
Okay. How might one obtain content that could be presented along these lines to, for example, local governments?
Well, I would recommend ecojurisprudence.org website, because they did a lot of work. It's an interactive map, and you can zoom in and pick out the different ordinances that have been passed around the country, say around the US, for example. And then they have, if you click on it, they'll take you directly to the original documents, so you can sort of see what these ordinances look like. I would say, just as a heads up, most of them are what I call the SOLDIF model, which is where the community said, hey, there's something bad happening. There's fracking or oil extraction or groundwater extraction, and this is a real problem. I don't like this happening to my natural systems, and I also don't like it's happening to my human health in some way. So they're more of a reaction. The Santa Monica ordinance is a little different in that there wasn't anything sort of problematic that was happening. It was more a reaction to Citizens United, the Supreme Court decision that gave corporations more power. And so the ordinance was to try to balance some of that and recognize communities' rights and nature's rights in the community as well. So I would go on to that website, and there's a fair amount of work there. And I would also recommend The Politics of Rights of Nature by Kaufman and Martin, and that's open access online. You go to MIT Press, and it's at the end of the PowerPoint, but it's a great book. It's very readable, and talks about some of these issues in a nice sort of summary way that I thought was really helpful, the way they put it together. So I think between that and that website, that's a good start.
Okay, great. So Karen, let me know when you want to switch over to the raised hand function. I have a ton of questions coming in through the chat, but I know you wanted to kind of give people a chance to speak directly.
Why don't we start now? Okay, it's about halfway.
Okay, so if you would like to provide a question to Linda directly, and I see one from Christopher Hall. So Karen, can you unmute Christopher?
I think he could unmute himself.
Okay.
Thank you very much for hosting this discussion. I have a question. There's two ways, if maybe there are three ways, but I only know of two about going about the rights of nature. One is the way where a community asserts its rights, asserts its sovereignty, and by doing so, then says we have the power to then assert the rights of nature for this particular river. And then what happens is that the state comes in and says, no, we are the top dog, you're a political subdivision, and you can't take power, that's settled law. This is what happened in Grant, Pennsylvania. And so while you may be concerned about either fracking or you're concerned about fertilizer in the river or whatever the issues are, you can just deal with that at the ordinance level, or you can try to tell us what for at the statutory level. You might even try a ballot, but the fact is that we control you. We haven't given you these particular powers. The other version, as you mentioned, Santa Monica, well, we don't really have a big issue on our hands, but we want to move the needle. And so we want to address this issue and slowly approach the problem of rights of nature or the solution of rights of nature over time. And we would like to work with the state. In fact, we would like to work with our representatives who are our friends and neighbors. They go to the farmers market with us. And we would like to try to get the state on board, because if we can't get the state on board, the chances of this maybe going through might be slim. When we look at Ecuador, they got the whole nation on board. So it was like, do we alienate our elected officials at the state level, or do we try to bring them in? And if we try to bring them in, obviously we have a public relations job with the whole public, and then we have the political job of lobbying. I think you could probably tell my favoring is the second one, but could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. No, that's, yeah, no. So, Danella Meadows talked about that as well. And her solution was to put your own people in power, to start to run candidates for political power. Well, you know, that's a longer term proposition. But all of these things fit together in the larger whole. You know, I don't know that Santa Monica is trying to move the California representatives along necessarily. The SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in California, the state law, is incredibly weak compared to the groundwater law that Santa Monica passed, which was quite controversial at the local level. So it's, you know, I think there's been, although it's slow, some movement in that regard. And I do think from a political point, even the ordinances that are passed that are eventually stomped down at the state level have an educational purpose as well, because people may be more concerned about their community rights when they're taken away, rather than when they realize that, hey, you know, I'm sure the state might be, you know, sort of working in good faith for me, but then to realize like, hey, I actually want to protect myself, and the state's lobbyists are saying no, that starts to build more political support, again, slowly. But that is a model that, you know, some organizations have been working towards, is, okay, we lost this one, but we're starting to build and change hearts and minds. If you read Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, they talk about how change comes about. And even, you know, the earth revolving around the sun, I mean, it takes a while. And sometimes you just have to let those people sort of like move on before you can get the people whose hearts and minds have been changed to start to really make a difference. So all of these things start to fit together. But I would still say, you know, the point is to keep moving forward in the way that makes the most sense for you.
Okay, Karen Pitts, why don't you unmute yourself? You have a question?
Yeah, so I work with Maasai people in Tanzania, and they're being evicted from their land, which is full of wildlife in Ngorongoro Conservation Area. And their land is because of especially because of the wildebeest that live there, is like a carbon bank, basically. And so I was wondering if one of these tribunals that you're talking about, is there a place where I can go to learn how to do one of those, or to get involved with that for these Maasai people?
Yeah, I mean, the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, I think it's garn.org.
Yeah, I
So
got the link to that.
Yeah, they have the tribunal link, which was also in the Trend Maya slide. But they have the tribunals that they hold, and there are other organizations that work in that space as well. Like Earth Law Center is another great organization that you might want to reach out to, and they're really good about working with folks who are interested in volunteering, their energy towards this goal. So I think they're particularly good at working with folks. Garn is more experienced, but then might be a little bit more understaffed. You might get a quicker response, but they're both wonderful, and doing amazing work.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, because just coming at it from the human rights angle, the UN rapporteurs can't even come into Tanzania without an invitation from the government.
Yeah. Well, and of course that their funding is limited in terms of how much they could do. So yeah, no,
Okay.
you want to try out any tool that you can.
Sure, thank you.
Good luck.
Okay. And Karen Ashiki, go ahead and unmute.
Thank you.
Karen Pitts, you put your hand down.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, just following issues like this across the country, and my own experience in working in communities, what happens is people come in and they request a permit from usually a city, or if we're really lucky, environmental protection assessment is required. Would this not be a good place to start requiring somebody on the planning commission and the city structures that help to evaluate the environment of a city or a region, to have some experts on their body to at least give a informed, perhaps scientific, perhaps from native people that know the area, opinion on this permit. Because if you've ever been in a permitting meeting, it doesn't have anything to do with that usually. But do you think that at a local level is something worth advocating for?
Well, absolutely. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you? I'm sorry.
No, go
Oh,
ahead.
okay. Yeah, absolutely. I think that the more information, especially on the other side of the dais, not just from in front of the microphone, but the people making the decisions, the more and louder voices that you have on that decision-making side, the better. If you're in an expert, advice is always good. California's CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, is more stringent than many other similar state environmental protection acts, and better than the national one, I think. But it still has its limitations, even though experts do weigh in. The challenge is that the system itself is designed and run under the frame of maximizing profit from the utilization of natural systems for whatever it is, human use that we want. A different system that was set up with, perhaps people representing nature in the majority vote, or representing indigenous peoples in the majority vote, would be an interesting approach, because it sort of starts to flip things upside down and recognize that we are part of the earth and we need to live more responsibly and respectfully, and having a voice as opposed to having the voice for earth is going to give you a different result. So it's better, but I think we can do even better than that. But again, you know, these things take time and we have to move in that direction. So it's a great, you know, step forward.
For me, I think probably where I would start at is to have a look at my city and see how your planning commission is, who appoints them. Is that a mayor? Do people vote for it? And to begin to advocate that these are elected or positions that have to fill certain requirements. You get a developer, you get an environmentalist, you get an air quality person, you know, let's try and do this smart, because it's right now, it's just how much money can the city make from it, you know?
Okay, I'm gonna go back into the chat because we still have a lot of questions. Oh, Christopher Hall, did you put your hand up again? Okay.
Thank you for letting me double dip. We know that the built environment sits within the natural environment. We know the built environment has grown so immensely that it's now clashing and impacting the natural environment, which is why we're referring to our epoch as the Anthropocene. Have you seen any kind of public relations, marketing, lobbying, or is there any kind of push to basically say, look, if we can continue to expand the built environment, well, maybe we can continue to expand the natural environment too? And in fact, I think the term rewilding terrifies anybody who's ever lived in an apartment before, so we'd stay away from that. But what about the possibility of using the rights of nature and the long-term move needle on this idea of expanding the natural environment, if for any other reason than to benefit the built environment? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, in addition to that, then the Nature Needs Half movement as well. We've got the 30 by 30 movement that has gotten a lot of traction here in California and, you know, at the international level, but there's also Nature Needs Half. So, you know, how much nature needs, people are moving at least in a positive direction there, and rewilding is part of that. But I would argue as well that the built environment is not really nested inside the natural environment, but is part of the natural environment. And so we can change our cities to be more in concert with natural systems. There are numerous ways that people are starting to do this. In being able to put more green spaces and more habitat connectors throughout cities, so that cities themselves feel more connected to natural systems as well. So I think that there's enormous opportunity and a lot of people working on that. So it's a very exciting option right now. In addition to passing laws, how do we implement that? And there's a lot of people thinking about that, fortunately.
Okay, Leah Sloan, would you like to unmute yourself? We only have a few minutes left, so I do ask if we can keep our questions here going forward to try to get in as many as possible. Can we be concise in our question asking?
Linda, thank you. This is terrific, and I want to ask you what continues to give you hope, but we'll get to that later. Many of us watching this evening are Sierra Club members, and that's indicative of the passion that we feel for trying to save and preserve various parts of our environment. And I, in particular, am in that forest and climate area of the Sierra Club. But one of the things that gives me great concern is the crossing of these two great emergencies in our time on the planet right now, and that is the damage that's happening to the natural world and the rush to try to shift our power over to electricity by building solar and wind. Yet the potential destruction that could be created by building solar and wind threatens a lot of the integrity of landscapes that are already too small to contain the wildlife that lives in them. And we know the bird populations have been, dropping precipitously. It is so frustrating to realize that there is no one really planning how to build out a renewable energy future. And that yet some of us Sierra Club members, are desperately trying to protect the natural environment so that it doesn't get sacrificed in pursuit of building, massive acres of solar panels, which would be good. But I wonder where you stand on this renewables versus natural environment, because this is a battle happening right now.
Yeah, no, and in addition to that, just the minerals that go with that and the metals that go with that, and deep sea mining is one of the scariest things that I've seen in quite a while as well. There are two things, people ask like, well, should we just stop what we're doing and go do rights of nature since, that you think that's better? And I would say, no, I mean, we have to keep our finger in the dike, while we're pursuing other options. And so looking at renewable energy is important to be able to counteract oil and gas, which is just pushing us off a cliff. But at the same time, as you say, we need to start to shift as soon as possible how we see ourselves in the world, how we see our place in the world, and what our duty and our responsibility is towards natural systems, towards Earth as a subject of this larger Earth-centered governance structure. So we do renewable energy, but we do it in the context of, do we need all this energy? Is this something that we have to do? Where can we start to cut back? How do we start to change our lifestyles in a way that's positive for us, not just something that, oh gosh, now I have, X cars instead of Y cars, but, maybe I get to spend more time with my family. Maybe I could walk to work instead of having to drive, things like that, and start to think about ways that we can recognize our relationship better and live in concert with the earth and give back, as Indigenous people know, give back more than we take. But also at the same time, develop the tools that we need for that amount of energy that we need to be able to live and to take care of our needs. And that's sort of a final point, I think, is Gandhi said, that we have enough for our need, but not enough for our greed. And we never stop to ask ourselves, we always assume we know what nature needs, and then we give it less. We cut that in half at least. But whatever we think we need, it tends to be, something that we don't really need, we get that conflated with something we want. So I think that we need to have our own self-reckoning at the same time. What is it we really need, and how do we get by, and what makes us happy? There've been a lot of reports on world happiness, and it tends to come down to friends and family and connections. That relationship building that I was talking about earlier, and nature is absolutely part of that relationship building. And sort of using that as our message, I think a really positive way will start to shift hearts and minds while we're sort of recognizing, okay, what is it we absolutely need, and then just go for that.
So we're at time. And so I want to apologize to those whose questions we ran out of time before we could get to, and maybe we could end, Linda, with Leah's initial question of how do you stay hopeful?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I would circle back for myself to how I first got engaged in rights of nature. I was feeling very frustrated, and someone recommended a book by Joanna Macy, who many of you probably know, called World is Lover, World is Self. And I started reading this book, and I was just blown away because she said, I fell in love with Earth. I love the Earth, and I'd never thought about my relationship with Earth, with forests, with rivers in that way. Those words had never occurred to me, not once. It was always like, well, I have to save the planet, and that shifted everything entirely for me. So my hope is that it comes from this idea of being able to say, I love the Earth, and whatever I decide to do from that space feels right. it feels good. So if I get astray, I try to come back to that, and that keeps me going.
And we'll end on that hopeful note. Linda, thank you so much for an amazing presentation, getting a lot of high fives in the chat. There was an inquiry, and Karen, maybe you could just let people know how to access the recording for this presentation, because people are interested in the slides, and those people who missed a little bit of the presentation are anxious to get what they didn't get.
So normally we put the recording on our resources page on the Stop Clearcutting California website. So it's sierraclub.org/clearcutting, and then you choose the resources tab. And Linda, would it be okay if we also had your slides on that and located in the same place? Would that be okay?
Sure. Yeah, that's fine.
All right.
And for those people who have, questions that we couldn't get to, but who are interested in pursuing the answers to those questions, would you be willing to share any contact information?
Oh, sure. Yeah, let me just throw that in the chat. I'll do that right now. Oops. My own email address.
Okay. Okay, so once again, thank you so much, Linda. We really appreciated you giving us a little bit of your time and attention, and good luck with you and your work on Environment Now.
Great.
And
Thank you. I'm sorry.
next month, we are going to have a presentation by Maya Kosla. Maya, having just spent the last couple of days with Maya in nature, I can promise you she also is somebody who resoundingly loves the earth. And she's going to pick up our conversation that we started last month about biomass incineration, focusing this time on what she's seeing and documenting on the West Coast. So we hope you'll all be able to join us for that presentation. It's you'll be getting more information via our website, on Facebook, on Instagram, as well as Karen Maki will send everybody an email that will allow you to register. So thank you, everybody.